Welcome to the Liberal Conservative Podcast. I am Clint Wayne.
And I am Colt D. Today we are marking the anniversary of the sinking of the USS Thresher, which was the first nuclear submarine the United States lost at April 10th, 1963. We're going to talk about the sequence of events which led up to the Thresher sinking, and then some submarine design improvements which have been made, thus preventing another boat being lost. Myself and Clint both have our submarine warfare pin, so we're actually uniquely qualified to talk on this subject, and it's near and dear to both of our hearts.
All right, so let's get started. So the information in this podcast that we reference comes from the United States Naval Institute. Also, I've read every book, every piece of literature I can get a hold of on the USS Thresher and also another submarine, the USS Scorpion, that was lost at sea. The Thresher was SSN 593. It was the first of a new class of submarines. So this was to be the most modern submarine in the world. Prior to the loss, they had conducted sea trials for the better part of 18 months, including depth charge testing. So on April 9th, 1963, the Thresher departed Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in Maine. They were for testing in preparation for the submarine going operational. The Thresher had been commissioned in 1961, but it was still not operational due to being the first in the new class and lots of new technology, new sonar system, probably the best sonar system in the world at that point in time. So this is where so sea trials are where the boat will go out. They test all their systems. They test it at various depths, making sure everything works, making sure all the shipyard work is complete. And to the satisfaction of the commanding officer. So on April 9th, about 0949 hours off the coast of Boston, the Thresher rendezvoused with the USS Skylark, which was their rescue ship for their sea trials. So on board the sub included 96 sailors, 16 officers, and 17 civilian contractors who were part of the shipyard. They were also some from Raytheon who had built the sonar system. Anyway, the civilian contractors there to fix any issues. Their expertise would help with any problems that came up. So the Thresher was to rendezvous the next morning with the Skylark at the deep dive point, which was approximately 200 miles east of Cape Cod. Hey, Colt, you were in the Navy way more recently than I was. Can you explain to the listeners how a sea trial works and the whole host ship part of this, which was the Skylark?
Yeah, so going back, in the 1960s, issues with submarines were far, far, far more common than they are now. To put it even into context, the Navy doesn't really utilize this sort of host assistant ship concept anymore. They still have the Naval Undersea Rescue Command, I believe is what it's called. And they're put on alert anytime a boat goes out for sea trials, but there's no real host ship. So I'll talk a little bit more in detail in a bit, but flooding on a submarine used to be a semi-regular occurrence. Because of these issues, especially with new equipment and repairs, subs would have a host ship to assist them anytime they went out for sea trials in case they needed assistance rendered to them. So they basically had the shipyard workers on board, which were presumably the system experts, and then obviously this host ship that I was just talking about. And this is, again, if anything happened to them, they were rendered immobile, or if they lost propulsion, then everybody would be right there ready to help them in case something like that happened.
Okay. So on April 9th, as we said, they rendezvoused with the Skylark off the coast of Boston. They started off their sea trials by making shallow dives on the way to the second rendezvous point, which I just told you was about 200 miles off the coast of Cape Cod. These shallow dives they get baseline data established, make sure everything works. And they determine if the testing should proceed. So if something would have happened that raised an alarm, they would not have done this deep dive. So we have to assume everything was running normally. The Skylark arrived at the rendezvous point about 0745 on April 10th. The Thresher reported via underwater comms that they had contact with the Skylark about 3,400 yards away. The Skylark did not have sonar contact with the Thresher. The Skylark sonar system had a range of about 3,700 yards. Now, this is not it's not unheard of for surface ships to not be able to detect submarines. To this day, Colt, I'm assuming the surface ships, their sonar is still iffy at best. Is that
Oh yeah,
true
absolutely.
statement? Okay. So like I said, it's not unheard of for the surface ships not to detect the submarines at distances much closer than 3,700 yards. So the Thresher was scheduled to dive to 1,300 feet. Colt, can you explain for the listeners what test depth is?
Yeah, so this is getting pretty deep into like the engineering aspect of it. A submarine is given a test depth based on its design. So to put it plainly, it's your maximum safe operating depth. So I know that's kind of a bunch of words jumbled in together. So this design takes into account all your hull parameters, your air bank capabilities, and all the big brain engineers give the boat a test depth. So this is the safest depth that the design has been tested to, and that is safe for the maximum depth that you can operationally go. I hope I worded that right.
I think that's right.
If that makes sense.
Yes. Okay. So now we told you that the Thresher contacted Skylark at 0745, said we have contact with you at 3,400 yards. This would have been a sonar contact. They were listening to the Skylark's engines, propellers, whatever. So at 0747, just 2 minutes later, the Thresher reported to the Skylark that they were commencing their deep dive test. The Skylark had remained in contact with the Thresher during the initial stages of the deep dive test. And I told you that they had contacted him through underwater communications. This is almost like an underwater walkie-talkie. And I don't know, Colt, if you've ever heard UWC, which is underwater communications, it's hard to understand. You have to talk really slow and enunciate your words. And I'm assuming back in 1963, it was not much better. So, as I said, they had contact. They reported that they were going to the deep dive. The Skylark remained in contact with them through the initial stages of the deep dive test. However, for some reason, the Skylark did not plot the Thresher's position during all this time. And the failure to plot that Thresher's location, it didn't really affect the outcome of what happened to the Thresher, but it dang sure made it more difficult to find the wreckage later on. And it took a while to find the wreckage. So at 9:12 in the morning on April 10th, the Skylark received a jumbled message relaying Thresher was experiencing, quote, minor difficulties and that they have a positive up angle and that they were attempting to blow. So what a positive up angle is, it means that the ship was pointed up. It was not going down. It was pointing up, trying to come out from below. Okay. Now, the Thresher did not have an emergency blow system that the submarines have today. And in order to come to the surface, the submarine has to blow high pressure air into the ballast tanks, forcing water out of the tanks, making the submarine more buoyant. So in my opinion, the transmission that said they had a positive up angle probably indicated that they at one point had an uncontrolled descent, which means they probably lost power, lost propulsion. So you're a mechanic, Colt, and I know you'll talk more about that in a second. So when they said that they had a positive up angle, it means that they were on their way back up. So, however, at 0914, the Skylark attempted to communicate several times with the Thresher, asking them if they were in control. They got no response. At 0916, they received a garbled transmission that was something unintelligible, and it said, they could make out at the very end, it said test depth. So it's kind of widely accepted that that the Thresher was saying they were exceeding test depth. Just after that transmission, they received another garbled transmission saying something unintelligible and 900 north. During the time, the Skylark heard two anomalies that were probably attempts of the Thresher to blow the main ballast tanks. So, just after 918, the Skylark heard a clear anomaly. And when I mean anomaly, that's a sonar term. It's something that's not normal, not natural. So they heard a clear anomaly at 918 that was likely a high energy disturbance that was likely the implosion of the Thresher. Now, You'll see. I watched a couple of documentaries on this earlier today and rewatched some. And one of the guys said he said that 900 north meant that they were on a bearing of 900 north. There is no bearing 900 north. So if you watch some documentaries on this, as you know, there's only 360 degrees in a circle. I think they were probably on a course of north and had made it to 900 feet from test depth. Um, Colt, do you have anything? Can you add to that?
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about basically how the propulsion kind of side of it. So I agree with you. There's a lot of things that basically indicate that they had some sort of exceeding of their test depth. So kind of it's not part of the subsafe program, but I don't really want to dive too deep into the subsafe program because that's a big, that's a deep hole. But I'm going to talk about the procedures regarding propulsion. So during those times, procedures were a lot different than now. Anytime there was an emergency with the engine room and the reactor, the procedures had them shut their steam supplies to the engine room as a way to preserve propulsion for later use when stability was achieved. Now, that was basically just seen as reactor protection so that there was no way that they were going to harm the reactor. So in my opinion, I think they were doing their testing. They had a loss of electrical power, which caused the reactor to shut down. And then based on procedures, they had them isolate the propulsion steam. So this would have had them have caused them to start sinking and quickly exceed their test depth. Anybody that's been on a submarine will know that no propulsion, you're not inherently buoyant. You will sink. So since I was in the Navy, I was trained that when they blew their main ballast tanks, they had moisture in the air banks, which caused the pipes to freeze, disabling their ability to come to the surface. So we'll obviously never know what the initial problem was, but I do believe that loss of propulsion, caused them to exceed their test depth. And then after the accident, the Navy changed their procedures, and that's not how things are done anymore. So, Clint, do you want to talk about some of the changes after the accident as well?
Yeah. So after the loss of the Thresher, very shortly after, the Navy instituted a program called SubSafe. This instituted several safety procedures along with improvements in design. One of the improvements was the installation of check valves in the main ballast tank blow system, along with an emergency blow system that the submarines still use today. So the check valves allowed condensation to gather in the check valve reservoirs and keep it out of the system. So anybody who's dealt with compressed air or knows anything about compressed air, as you compress air, obviously you're creating friction, it creates heat. Once it cools, you have condensation. So when the compressed air is pumped into the main ballast tanks, it's coming from a compressed state and it's expanding rapidly. So you're cooling it rapidly, creating more condensation. So this condensation froze, making blowing the main ballast tanks impossible. So I've read many documents and watched documentaries on the Thresher I told you, and I believe that transmission about test depth says that they were exceeding test depth. So once they exceeded test depth, they blew the main ballast tanks. The compressed air system failed because of the condensation in the pipes. So the compressed air works almost just like an air conditioning system with Freon, where the Freon expands, it cools. So it worked the same way, and it froze these pipes. So once they're not getting air into the main ballast tanks, you're not removing water, so you're like Colt said, you're not buoyant. So I believe that when they made it to 900 feet is when that last transmission came, and that's probably about the time that they realized they're not getting any air into the ballast tanks. And it was right after that last transmission that the Skylark heard the implosion. The only other nuclear submarine lost at sea was the USS Scorpion, which was lost in 1968. And it's kind of interesting. The only other one that's lost, I just said, is the Scorpion, and it's one of the very few at the time that had not been backfitted with subsafe modifications, and that was due to the Cold War and their operational tempo. We call op tempo. So, Colt, can you tell them a little bit more about what the emergency blow system does now, how it works now?
Yeah, absolutely. So now, and I believe this came out with the subsafe program, it's slang on a submarine, you call them chicken switches, and that's because the actuation levers are basically, they have these little, we'll call them like safety clamps, and you have to manually depress them. But anyway, the levers themselves look like chicken legs. So compared to what they had back then, these chicken switches, whenever you actuate them, automatically allow air to go into the ballast tanks. What they had on the Thresher was where they would have to go basically make an announcement and say, emergency below the main ballast tanks or something to that tune, and then have to have people go and run and manually initiate air. Obviously, a lot longer, not a expeditious means at all. So nowadays, like I said, this is an automatic means with a throw of a switch, and it happens within seconds. So yeah, I've experienced it, not an emergency. You do testing on it whenever you're on a submarine. I think it's once a year. And it is a very, very quick system. Clint, I don't know if you've ever experienced an emergency blow, either for real or in testing, but it's very quick.
Yeah. So, I mean, I've experienced an emergency blow both in an emergency and during testing. So, and I'll tell you, the submarine community is very strong, very small. So is it 1%, Colt, or 4% of the Navy?
Yeah, 1% of the Navy is submariners.
So, and these men are very highly trained, and actually now they're women. They're men and women on board submarines now. When I was in, there was no women, but they're highly trained. We train constantly on damage control procedures. When we're in port, we're constantly training at what they call a wet trainer, which is controlling flooding. And when I was a sailor, there was only 3 times that I thought we were going to lose a ship. One of them is classified, but one of them was a loss of propulsion, and we were at test depth. So we were coming out of the shipyard, and I was on the fathometer. The fathometer is in the control room where everything happens, where all these chicken switches are. All the pumps are there, or the controls for the pumps. So, and when we lost propulsion, it was so dark on that submarine for about 5 to 10 seconds that I could not see the hand in front of my face. If my hand was touching my face, I couldn't have seen it. And an emergency blow saved us. And let me tell you, man, we flew to the surface from test depth all the way to the surface. We flew. So, and the one time was actually my last deployment. And this is an example of how well trained they are. So I was asleep in the bow compartment. So the bow compartment, for those that don't know what a bow is, the bow is the front of the ship. Generally on submarines, at least the old ones that I was on, the sleeping quarters are all the way in the front. So we had a fire in the very back of the boat, which is the engineering spaces. So when the alarm sounded, before I could get out of the rack, the entire submarine was full of smoke. And I can distinctly remember thinking, damn it, I'm on my last deployment and now I'm going to die. And a fire on a submarine is a major problem. They say if a fire burns more than 2 minutes, the likelihood of losing the ship goes up exponentially. So, and let me tell you why. So when a fire starts, it starts burning electrical hull fittings, which are where cabling runs out from the inside, from the pressure holes, what we call it, out to the outside for sensors and things like that. Well, once fire starts, those cables start burning away. Well, then you have flooding. So once you have flooding, then you have equipment start to fail. Then you lose propulsion. It just compounds, and it continues to compound. So I will tell you, the men of the Thresher were probably working their butts off to save that ship. And I promise you, before they died, they knew exactly what was going to happen. So Colt, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, something I've realized. So I'll give a quick sea story. Yeah, so basically same thing. I've had a fire on board 2 times when I was on a submarine. And then I think when I was doing testing to go up under the ice caps during ICEX, we did an emergency blow. Something that you didn't really allude to, but I just thought about it, and it may not be obvious. When there's a fire on board a submarine, the smoke doesn't go anywhere. It stays there, so you can't see anything. And that's also including if there's no lights, if there's flooding. I mean, you get where I'm going. This is not, it gets very bad very quickly. And then, yeah, I just want to say, like you said, when we did an emergency blow to test some of our ICEX mods, we were at, I want to say close to test depth, and we went to the surface probably in about 10 seconds. It was ridiculous. The craziest thing I've ever experienced on a submarine.
Yeah. So, and I've been sitting on, I was a sonar tech and I was sitting on the sonar stack for a couple of emergency blows. And it's kind of cool when you fly out of the water, you can actually hear the seawater dripping off the hydrophones before you slam back down into the water. It's pretty cool. But obviously
Oh,
not at that time. It was not cool because I just can't imagine what these guys were going through, because once they lost propulsion, we really don't know what happened. You have to kind of assume that they had some casualties, such as flooding or fire. So something had to have happened to make them lose propulsion. I don't know that anybody knows. But anyway, they were
yeah.
fighting for for their lives, and they ultimately lost their lives.
Yeah, when I was in the Navy, the common thought was that they had some sort of flooding casualty that basically made the reactor shut down itself, like water sprayed on switchboards, which is kind of what I was alluding to earlier. Flooding was a lot more common back then because they used silver brazed pipes, which is horrible for pressure fittings. So that was kind of just an assumption that people made, and are kind of, it's kind of what gets thrown around whenever if you're in the Navy.
Yeah. Hey, so in closing, Colt and I, as we just told you, we were on submarines, and if any of the family members of people on the Thresher end up listening to this, just know that we're thinking about you. We always think about you every year when this comes around, and anytime I see across the world that a submarine comes, I think of those people. When I was in the Navy, the Scorpion had got lost in '68, and I was in the Navy in the '80s, and the chief of the boat's name was Wally Bishop, and he had a daughter, and she was so good to us. She was always around. In Norfolk, I was stationed in Norfolk at Pier 22, which was the same pier the Scorpion was lost from. So it's a small community, and I'm assuming that Wally's daughter is still alive. She would probably be in her 70s now. So anyway, our thoughts are with you guys. If you have family members that were lost on the Thresher or the Scorpion. So Colt, you want to close us out?
Yep. I should say, I appreciate the service members, the submariners. Like you said, I've missed a couple Christmases being on submarines, and submariners are always close to our hearts in this household. So, also, I apologize to listeners. I was actually sick yesterday. That's why this episode's coming out a little late, but we will be back in 2 weeks.
Hey, thank you guys for coming.